Quiet on the Western Front and Farewell to Arms. All Quiet on the Western Front, as I said, we'll be seeing both, we'll read the novel, also see the movie version, excellent movie. The importance of All Quiet on the Western Front, Im Westen nichts Neues, in the original German title by Erich Maria Remarque, during the period right after the novel appeared, about 6 million copies sold. And it kept selling, and it still keeps selling, and it's been translated to over 28 languages. Because it's not only a great chronicle of World War I, it's the ultimate anti-war novel of all time, the ultimate pacifist novel. Because World War I, in many ways, was the prelude to the ultimate war of all time, was World War II. And also, not surprisingly, Erich Maria Remarque was a German writer. I mean, that is surprising that he would write this anti-war, anti-militarist novel. But of course, when the Nazis came along in 1933, the first thing they did was burn his book, amongst many others that were unacceptable because of his anti-militarism. But there's another German writer, we're going to be reading him also, Ernst Jünger, his Storm of Steel, which is the opposite. He was a big militarist and praised the military undertakings of World War I as a pain or an ode to the greatness of militarism, of battle, of how, how it ennobles the soul, and so on and so forth. So that's the other side of it. And then we're going to read all of these poems as well. But, and there's a packet of poems, if it's not already posted, it will be very shortly. Amongst the prose pieces is a very, very interesting short story. That's what we're going to be looking at today, by a guy by the name of John Galsworthy. So let me tell you something about him. Interesting figure, very important writer. You might be familiar with his trilogy of 3 novels, the Forsyth Saga, which was actually made into a TV serial a few years ago. I'm not going to say when it was. Also, a few months ago, in the middle of the pandemic, because there was nothing much to do except sneak out once in a while and head over to the Argosy used bookstore without my family knowing. And I was actually able to find a short novel by Galsworthy called Solmes and the Flag, also about World War I, and it's actually signed by Galsworthy. Very, very interesting fellow. So who was he? And what was his claim to fame? Very interesting life. John Galsworthy was actually born August 14th, 1867. He died January 31st of 1933, which is all kinds of interesting because that was actually the month and the year in which the Nazis took over Germany. He was an English novelist, he was a playwright, and his most famous works include the Forsyth Saga that I mentioned. That was written over a period of many years, from 1906 to 1921. And then there were sequels that he wrote to it as well. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, actually in 1932. He was born in what is now known as Galsworthy House, it's named for him, but then it was called Parkhurst in Kingston Hill in Surrey, England. He was the son of John and Blanche Bailey Galsworthy. Came from a very prosperous family, well-established, with a lot of property in Kingston upon Thames, and it's now the site of 3 schools, the Marymount International School, the Rokeby Preparatory School, and the Holy Cross Preparatory School. He attended Harrow, very important, a very prestigious preparatory school, Harrow, and also New College and Oxford University. He took a second in law, in jurisprudencia. He was a lawyer. I mean, he had a law degree. He was smart enough not to practice law. But he got that degree in jurisprudence at Oxford in 1889. By the way, in England, that was still the same. But actually, you can get an undergraduate degree in law, a bachelor's of law, and that's the equivalent of getting a doctor of jurisprudence in an American law school. In fact, way back when, I was with this large, prestigious Wall Street law firm called Cadwallader, Wickersham and Taft, and a friend of mine actually graduated with an undergraduate degree in law from Cambridge University in England. So I guess you can still do it. Anyway, he trained as a barrister and was called to the bar. That is, he became a lawyer, not the bar where you belly up to the bar. And he was called to the bar in 1890. A barrister is one, I'm probably getting mixed up. In England, there are barristers and the solicitors. Barristers, I think, the most actually litigate litigate cases in the courtroom. Solicitors do all kinds of preparation of documents and all kinds of, contracts and all this kind of boring stuff in the office. He was a barrister, but he wasn't keen to practice law, smart man. And instead he traveled abroad because the family became rich because they had a shipping business, international shipping. And this allowed him to, it was even better than being in the Navy. I mean, his father owned the business. So he traveled ostensibly to look after the family business all over the world. And interesting, one of the people he met in his sojourns was another individual who became a very famous writer, but also early in life was just getting employment on different commercial vessels and commercial ships, traveling the world that way. And that was Joseph Conrad. You might have read The Heart of Darkness, The Secret Sharer, maybe in high school. Joseph Conrad, of course, was actually Polish. He was born in Krakow, I believe. But and English was not even obviously not his first language. I don't even think it was his second language. And yet he was one of the greatest English language writers of all time. But anyway, Galsworthy met Joseph Conrad on one of these ocean voyages of his. And then in 1895, Galsworthy began an affair with a woman by the name of Ada Nemesis Pearson Cooper. She was actually the wife of his cousin. They had a very long affair before they finally actually got married. I mean, at some point, ultimately, people became aware of what happened, and she, in the meantime, left her husband, who was his cousin, and they married later on. In 1921, he was elected the first president of Penn International, the International Literary Club, which is a big deal. It's only the most celebrated and well-known writers of the day are in that literary fraternity. And he was appointed to the Order of Merit in 1929. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, as I said, in 1932. And he was nominated also by Governor Henrik Schurk, member of the Swedish Academy. The Nobel Prize comes out of Sweden. But he was too ill to attend the prize presentation on December 10th of 1932. He died 7 weeks later. And he donated the prize money from the award he got as winner of the Nobel Prize to the Penn International organization. He was involved in he had many causes that he championed. He was all in favor of women's rights and animals' rights, prison reform. I mean, he was a very progressive individual who was not just a literary figure, but also a social activist. Very interesting fellow, and a recognized Nobel Prize winner and a great contributor to modern British literature. Now, the story that I posted for you is called Told by the Schoolmaster. And it's a very moving and a very interesting piece of fiction. If we were in class and I had access to my office, I should have taken it when I had the opportunity. I have a book called Boy Soldiers of the First World War. And it's a big, thick book, because what happened in World War I was all of the enthusiasm that was generated at the beginning of the war. There's like war fever. We sort of spoke about it. In Germany, they were all gung-ho and going off to war. It wasn't just Germany. It was true in France. It was true in England. And the enthusiasm was so overwhelming that individuals wanted to actually join the war effort, even though they were not really qualified. In many instances, they were just not old enough. But what happened was two things. One, as the war dragged on and the government was in need of more soldiers, they sort of turned a blind eye, and they sort of let youngsters enlist, even though, according to the law, they were not of an appropriate age yet to participate. And the other reason that in England, I guess in other places too, but one of the reasons in England that there was such a surge of youngsters eager to go off and fight in the First World War, these, for the most part, were youngsters from small towns and villages, and life was pretty boring. And you were born there, you grew up there, you grew old there, and you died there, and you never saw anything else. Maybe, if you were lucky, you got to see London in your lifetime, but that was it. Here is the opportunity to go overseas, actually to go to another country, to go to France or Belgium, fight on the Western Front. And that was very appealing, and it was a draw, for many youngsters. So it was not an unusual at all situation like the one being told in the story, where individuals below the age of recruitment suddenly found themselves bearing arms and fighting in this war. The youngest person actually to fight in World War I was a kid who was 12 years old. But again, it was not uncommon for 13, 14, 15-year-olds to find their way into the army and cross the Channel, end up on the battlefields of France and Belgium. And many of them, needless to say, lost their lives there. They were hardly fit, for military service, and it was, as we know, a pretty brutal war. So what takes place in this particular story is a reflection, really, of that phenomenon, of these youngsters. And this is a particularly tragic story, but the ending speaks volumes. And we're going to discuss exactly what is the symbolism of the way this story ends, because the ending is mind-boggling, but not inconsistent with historical truth. But that ending is Galsworthy's way of making a very profound point about war in general and this war. Although I should have mentioned that Galsworthy was not against Britain entering World War I. The reason he wanted Britain to enter the war was because the danger he saw in Germany. And but interestingly, unlike other writers who came to the conclusion at the end, what, we got nothing from this war because it's death, suffering, and whatever, but we defeated the Germans, and at least we accomplished, halting the imperial and militaristic aims of Germany. Galsworthy was sort of a unique voice. He said, no, we got nothing out of the war at the end. Everything that was before is as it was now. In other words, nothing changed by virtue of the First World War. Of course, I just totally disagree with. The entire map of Europe changed. On the other hand, he did die in 1933 when the Nazis actually took over the German government, but he certainly saw the trend in the 20s in the Weimar Republic and leading up to what happened in Germany. And maybe his response that nothing changed meant, yeah, we didn't really take care of the Germans in World War I. We just postponed it. And what they wanted to do in World War I, he wasn't there for World War II, but what they've now achieved in terms of taking over that government is probably worse than what we had before when we went off to war against them in World War I. Anyway, so this particular story is... Someone has... Okay. So again, it's told by the schoolman. It's told from the perspective of a schoolman, a teacher in a rural village school in England. And he's telling a story about two of his former students, one of whom has now gone off to fight in World War I, even though he's below age. the whole issue, by the way, of youngsters fighting for one reason or another is going to be important also in Erich Maria Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, because that novel begins, and the movie is even more poignant in that respect, begins in a classroom in Berlin, in Germany, and the teacher, who's an older guy, probably fought in the Franco-Prussian War, is encouraging all of his students to go off and fight for the fatherland. And he whips up all kinds of patriotic and nationalistic enthusiasm, and all of them are jumping up and down, and yeah, I'm going, I'm gonna, whatever, I'm enlisting. Except for one guy who is not so fast, but felt what they call it today peer pressure. And well, all of his buddies are going off, he's got to go off too. You can imagine what his fate was. So the focus on youth is very important also in terms of another aspect of World War I, a cultural one that we didn't discuss, but I might have mentioned in passing. The generation of World War I was known as the lost generation. Why were they a lost generation? They were young, and then they had to go off to war. They missed that period in their lives when, normally you prepare professionally in terms of your family, in terms of, providing an income and establishing yourself as the head of the household and so on. They missed all of that. They were off, if they managed to come back even, but they were off on the battlefield. They missed that transitional period, that period of preparation and maturity. And in the case of some who had actually sought to go on and continue their education, they didn't have that opportunity either. They basically ended in what was high school. So they were limited even in terms of their academic studies and so on. So it was a lost generation, and it was sort of the symbol in many ways for the horror and the tragedy of World War I. Because either they died young on the battlefield, a life cut short and unfulfilled, or if they managed to survive and come back, they came back scarred, and they came back unprepared, and they came back now having to figure out how to transition into a world that was, light years away from what they were experiencing, in the battlefield, so they couldn't even relate. Everyone who was not involved in the war couldn't relate to them, so they were alienated, isolated, and also totally unprepared for what life had in store for them in the future. So there were all kinds of unfortunate, we talked about shell shock, but it was more than that even. There were also other social and other kinds of problems that afflicted that lost generation. I hope we have time. I think we will. There's a movie I want to show, an incredible movie. It's called M, the letter M. It's a German movie made during the Weimar Republic. It's actually based on a true story about a serial murderer. And finally they capture him. I don't want to give the whole story away. How he's captured is a crazy story. But the way he tried to justify, or at least mitigate what he'd done, was at the very end, he's before this tribunal, and he starts screaming. By the way, that's in the original screen, we call it in German Drehbuch, it's the screenplay. In the movie, they had to change it. But in the original, draft of the script, of the movie, he says, I can't help it. I spent 4 years on the Western Front. All I did was kill and see people killed. I can't help it. I can't stop killing. Right. So I hope we see that movie. It's incredible. Again, the impact on the youth during World War I was the greatest impact of all. Right? Either they were the lost generation, or they never made it back, or they suffered the very serious consequences, physical, mental, and everything else that came along with it. All right, so let's get to the story itself. And very interesting story. We all remember, by the way, this is a short story, I'll read it all. And when we get to the novels reading, I'll just be reading excerpts here and there, to make the main point, although I hope you'll read the entire novel, not all that long. Anyway, we all still remember, I suppose, the singular beauty of the summer when the war broke out, right? I mentioned many times that summer of 1914, amazingly, was one of the most beautiful summers in European memory. European weather is really not that great. The winters are unbearable, freezing cold and snow and ice and sleet. Not much of a spring, to the extent there is one. I guess it's nice. Even the summers, and I've spent many in Europe, it just rains all the time. But that particular summer, ironically, of 1914 was just a beautiful summer. It was warm, balmy, didn't rain. I was then the schoolmaster in a village on the Thames. Thames is, of course, the river that runs through England, through London. And he was a schoolmaster. He was a teacher, I guess he was also like the principal. Nearly 50, with a game shoulder and extremely deficient sight, there was no question of my fitness for military service, right? They weren't going to call him up to fight. He was 50 years old and his sight wasn't great and his arm was injured or whatever. And this, as with many other sensitive people, induced in me, I suppose, a mood abnormally receptive. Meaning what? Since I wasn't called up to partake or participate in the heat of the battle, I was more receptive to what was going on. I was an observer from afar. And so I watched everything that was going on locally and abroad and so on. The perfect weather, that glowing countryside, and corn harvest just beginning, and the apples already ripening, the quiet nights trembling with moonlight and shadow, and in it all, this great horror launched and growing, the weasening of Europe deliberately undertaken, the death warrant of millions of young men signed, such summer loveliness walked hand in hand with murder, thus magnified beyond conception, was too piercingly ironical. All right, so what a beautiful opening. He's a writer, right? So he's making a sharp contrast. The summer was beautiful, warm, balmy. It's towards the end of the summer, right? The war broke out in August. It's towards the end of the summer. And the trees are ripening, or they're already ripened. The sun is glowing, right? The moonlight is clear and shining and so on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, there's a war going on, and the summer loveliness is walking hand in hand with murder. All right, let me ask you, murder? People get killed in a war, yeah? Is it murder or is it killing? Maybe there's a difference. Clearly there is. And clearly, at the end of the story, the difference becomes clear. When you kill someone, I took criminal law years and years and years ago, but there are different, there's intention, there's murder, first degree, second degree, third degree, there's negligent homicide, there's this, that, and the next thing. And there are gradations, right? But murder is distinct in that it requires what's called Latin mens rea, a mindset. It's intentional. You intend to kill someone, right? And you commit the act with that intent of taking the life of a person, right? That's murder. It might be first degree, it might be second degree, but it's murder. Go off to war, and going off to war implies you can be carrying arms and killing the enemy. You're not murdering the enemy, even though you intend to kill him, but it's part and parcel of what war entails, and it's either you kill him or it kills you. So it's something like justifiable homicide. Right? So killing isn't murder, but here the author's saying these young men are being sent off to murder. But the question is, and that's going to be the point at the end, who exactly is murdering whom? So keep that in mind. One of those evenings, toward the end of August, when the news of Mons is a battle in Mons is a town in Belgium, and that was one of the early battle sites. When the news of Mons was coming through, I felt my house at the end of the village street, and I left my house at the end of the village street and walked up toward the downs. Down is like the center of a village or town, it's the grassy knoll in the middle. I've never known anything more entrancing than the beauty of that night. All was still and colored like the bloom of dark grapes, so warm, so tremulous, right? It's a beautiful summer evening. A rush of stars was yielding to the moon, fast riding up, and from the corn stalks, or stalks, I guess in English, American English, of that early harvest, the shadows were stealing out, right? It's the beginning of the harvest season, which again is sort of an irony that he's setting up. Harvest is when the crops have reached maturity, right? But the soldiers being sent out as young men, and in this case, 2 young men, are hardly at that point of maturity. They have hardly reached the point in life where they, are fully ripened and grown. We had no daylight savings then. By the way, daylight savings started Saturday night, and just as a footnote, daylight savings came with World War I. It was one of the innovations to try and save fuel and electricity by making the day start earlier and end earlier. We had no daylight savings then, and it was perhaps past 9 when I passed 2 of my former scholars, meaning students, a boy and a girl, standing silently at the edge of an old gravel pit opposite a beech clump, opposite a clump of trees. They looked up and gave me good evening. Passing on over the crest, I could see the unhedged fields to either hand, the corn stalked and the corn standing, just gilded under the moon. The swelling downs of a blue-gray and the beech clump I had passed dark cut against the brightening sky. If you ever, I teach comp lit at Baruch, so if you ever read any romantic poetry, it sounds like Wordsworth's lines written 5 miles above Tintern Abbey, one of those other ones. It's very sort of neo-romantic kind of description of the natural surroundings. The moon itself was almost golden, as it would be warm to the touch, and from it came a rain of glamour over sky and fields, woods and downs, farmhouses, and the river down below. All seemed in a conspiracy of unreality to one obsessed like me by visions of the stark and trampling carnage going on out there, right? What is he talking about? The out there is what in America they call in World War I over there, right? In other words, the out there is the other side of the British Channel in the battlefields of Europe, Western Europe, Belgium, France, right? So there's a sharp contrast and irony between the peaceful, tranquil, beautiful, natural setting that he's standing in and what he knows is going on the other side of the channel, on the continent, and the massacre and the bloodletting and all of the horrors of the war. Refuging from that grim comparison, I remember thinking that Jim Beckett and Betty Roof were absurdly young to be sweethearting, if indeed they were, for they hadn't altogether looked like it. What is he talking about? This is a young man and a young girl. They were his students a year or so before, and now they're out on this beautiful summer night, and so they must be dating. Obviously, they're involved with each other in a sort of innocent, romantic way, but it's not sure. Is that what's going on? They could hardly be 16 yet, for they had only left school last year. Betty Roof had been head of the girls, an interesting child, alert, self-contained with a well-shaped, dark-eyed little face and a head set on very straight. So there's going to be another contrast. The girl, Betty Roof, he describes, the way she looked and so on, but with a head on very straight. In other words, well-grounded, not, a dreamy pie in the sky kind of a person. She knew what was going on, and she knew how to act accordingly, and she knew exactly how to rationally respond. She was the daughter of the village laundress, and I used to think too good for washing clothes, but she was already at it. And if things went in that village, would probably go on doing it until she married. So her mother, she was a single mother, earned whatever living she earned by taking in laundry. And now her daughter was going to do the same thing. And he thought, she's too good for this. But the way things work in this little village of ours, that's the way it works. And her potential lost. She's going to wash clothing like her mother washed clothing, and then she'll get married and she'll be a wife and a mother, or whatever. Jim Beckett, who's the guy, was working on Carver's farm down there below me, and the gravel pit was about halfway between their homes. A good boy, Jim, freckled, reddish in the hair, and rather too small in the head. So that could be meant two ways, and it probably is. One, his head apparently was proportionally smaller, too small for his body. But if you contrast it with what he just said about Betty Roof, he means something else. Her head was on straight. In other words, she knows what to do and how to do it, and she's perfectly grounded. His head is too small, meaning he's not so well grounded. He's not so rational and logical. Quite the contrary, as you'll see. So stark contrast between them. But nice enough guy, freckled guy, reddish hair, blue eyes. And he looked at you very straight. And a short nose, well-grown boy, very big for his age, and impulsive in spite of the careful stodginess of all young rustics. So what is he saying about him? He was very impulsive. Impulsive means what? He doesn't think things through. He just acts on impulse, right? And that's very contrary to the natural tendencies of these young guys in these rustic, village settings in the sticks. They're usually very focused on what they do. And they think twice before they do anything. They're very slow in making decisions. He, on the other hand, is just, makes a decision right away, impulsively, without thinking it through, and obviously paying the consequences. But also a great deal of obstinacy too. Not a good combination. He was not only impulsive, but he was obstinate. In other words, my way or the highway. When I decide something, that's it, and I'm not changing, and I know better. So this is really a deadly combination, to act on impulse and then to refuse to change your mind about anything. Altogether an interesting blend. Well, not just an interesting blend, it turned out being a deadly blend. I was still standing there when up he came on his way to Carver's, and I looked back to the next moment with as much regret as to any in my life, because in retrospect, the schoolmaster realized he made a deadly mistake. He let something go by that he really shouldn't have. What happened? He held out his hand. That's the boy, Jim. He held out his hand. Goodbye, sir, in case I don't see you again. Why? Where are you off to, Jim? Joining up. Joining up? But my dear boy, you're 2 years underage, at least. Right? You're joining the army. You're not old enough to join the army. He grinned. I'm 16 this month, but I bet I can make out to be 18. They ain't particular, I'm told. Right, they need bodies, right? So it was a fact that in the recruitment stations in England, they turned a blind eye to the actual age of some of these guys who came in to join up, and let them through, even though they were below the age required to join the army. I looked him up and down. It was true. He could pass for 18 well enough. With military needs what they were, they needed soldiers, and possessed, as everyone was just then, by patriotism and anxiety at the news, right? So everyone was possessed by what? Patriotism. I'm going to go off and fight for the country. Everyone, it was war fever. It's great. You have to do this for the, for Mother England or whatever. It's for the glory of the empire and so on. And there was a lot of anxiety. Things aren't going as quickly and as well as they expected. So all of a sudden, a lot of youngsters like that are off to fight. And the need for more of these soldiers allowed the government to sort of let them through, even though legally they were not of age. I don't think you ought, Jim, but I admire your spirit. He stood there silent, sheepish at my words, and then, well, goodbye, sir. I'm going to something or other for 20. No, I'm not going to tell you the name of the place. Why? Besides a piece of fiction, but the point is that during the war, I guess during every war, the government doesn't divulge locations. If you're a soldier and you're writing home, of course, there are military censors. They censor everything you write. And the one thing they will not allow you to write is where you are, because then it could be intercepted by the enemy, and then they could have advanced info about where the troops are stationed and what their next move is going to be. So that sort of military protocol he carries into the story. So we don't know exactly which town he's talking about, but this is the town he has to go to sign up. I gave his hand a good hard squeeze. He grinned again, and without looking back, ran off down the hill toward Carver's farm, leaving me alone once more with the unearthly glamour of that night. God, what a crime was war. Now, remember, Goldsworthy was in favor of the British entry into that war, but he sort of had a pacifist bent. It was part of his liberal outlook, and he thought war in itself was a crime. Now, there are crimes of war crimes. By the way, that concept came out of World War II. But what he's saying here, and you have to see the whole story and it's, how it connects beginning, middle, and end. First, he said that the soldiers are committing murder, basically. Murder? Well, why does he use the word murder? Then he's saying war is a crime. And the notion of crime is going to be very important at the end of the story when we hear what happens. The question is, who's committing the crime? Who's committing the murder? And obviously that's going to be the moral or the lesson of this story. So he sees this youngster, was a student, now he's going to go off and fight. He's underage. And he says, war is a crime. From this hushed moonlit peace, boys were hurrying off to the business of man-made death, as if there were not nature's death galore to fight against, right? As if nature doesn't, we're sitting in the middle of one right now, as if nature doesn't provide enough reasons for death and illness and then pandemics and everything else. Now we have to add to that, he said, going off to war, and another source of death and suffering and so on. But it's man-made. And we can only admire them for it. Well, I have never ceased to curse the sentiment which stopped me from informing the recruiting authorities of that boy's real age, right? And this is going to be his sense of guilt. Why didn't I stop this? I know how old he is. I could have interceded and made sure he didn't go off. But there's more to the story. Crossing back over the crest of the hill toward home, I came on the child Betty, that's the girlfriend, at the edge of the gravel pit where I had left her. Well, Betty, was Jim telling you? Yes, sir, he's going to join up. And what did you say to him? I said he was a fool, but he's so headstrong, Jim. Her voice was even enough, but she was quivering all over. It's very plucky of him, Betty. Jim just gets things into his head. I don't see that he has any call to go and leave me. Right? He makes these impulsive decisions. Now he's going off. He's leaving me. I couldn't help smile. She saw it and said sullenly, right, so why is he smiling, schoolmaster? He's saying, all right, these are two kids, right? What do you mean he's leaving you? I mean, sort of childhood romance here or something. Two kids. It's not like he's leaving you. You're not married or whatever. Yes, I'm young, and so's Jim, but he's my boy for all that. And then, ashamed or startled at such expansiveness, she tossed her head, swerved into the beech clump like a shying fowl, and ran off among the trees. I stood a few minutes listening to the owls, and then went home and read myself into forgetfulness on Sir Walter Scott, the writer, on Scott's first polar book. So Jim went, and we knew him no more for a whole year. And Betty continued with her mother washing for the village, right? So he's off, right? The year will pass before he reappears. Betty is washing clothes like her mother. In September 1915, just after term had begun again, I was standing one afternoon in the village schoolroom, pinning up on the wall a pictorial piece of imperial information for the benefit of my scholars. Again, scholars here are students. And thinking, as usual, of the war and its lingering deadlock, right? What he's pinning up, the government puts out, they didn't have TV, probably not even, I say radio then, but they didn't certainly have the internet or anything else. So the government would print maps that followed the progress of the war and where the troops are moving, where the battles are, and so on. So he, as a teacher, put the map up on the wall, and we stick pins in as the information comes in and the troops are moving to another position. But it was a lingering deadlock, as we know. Nothing was happening. The sunlight slanted through onto my dusty forms and desks, and under the pollard lime trees on the far side of the street, I could see a soldier standing with a girl. Suddenly, he crossed over to the school, and there in the doorway was young Jim Beckett in his absurd short-tailed khaki jacket, square and tanned to the color of his freckles, looking indeed quite a man, right? So he's back there for some reason. Why? Why is he back? It's the middle of a deadly war and a deadlock, right? And I don't think anyone's allowed to leave the front. How do you do, sir? And you, Jim? Oh, I'm fine. I thought I'd like to see you. Just got our marching orders, and I'm off to France tomorrow. Been having my leave. I felt the catch at my throat that we all felt when youngsters whom we knew were going out for the first time. Meaning going out to war. Was that Betty with you out there? Yes, fact is, I've got something to tell you, sir. She and I were spliced last week at wherever. What do you mean, splice? Strange euphemism, right? What does it mean to splice? Some usually used in terms of electricity, right? You take two wires and you join them together. That's known as splicing, right? So it's just, I guess, a way of saying in the parlance of the rural areas of England, we got married, we got hitched, we got spliced. We've been staying there since, and I brought her home today as I got to go tonight, right? So they were staying wherever this place is. They got married. They stayed there for a while, but he's got to go off to France to fight. So he brought her back home. I was staring hard, and he went on hurriedly. She just went off there, and I joined her for my leave. We didn't want any fuss, you see, because of our being too young. Apparently, they're not too young for him to go to the army, maybe even too young for them to get married. The blankness of my tone took the grin off his face. Well, I was 17 a week ago, and she'll be 17 next month. In other words, she was too young. Married? Honest Injun Jim? He went to the door and whistled. In came Betty, dressed in dark blue, very neat, very self-contained. Only the flush on her round, young face marked any disturbance. Show him your lines, Betty, and your ring. The girl held out the official slip, marriage license, and from it I read that a registrar had married them at whatever this place is, under right names and wrong ages. He lied about his age to get in the army, they lied about their age to get married. And then she slipped the glove off and held up her left hand, and there was the magic hoop. Well, the folly was committed, no use in grabbing it, right? They've done it, what am I going to do? Too late to stop them. What's the joke? That marriage is a three-ring event, whatever. Well, first you get the engagement ring, right? And then, like Betty, you get the wedding ring, and then comes the suffering. No, it's just a joke. All right. Very good of you to tell me, Jim, I said. Am I the first to know? Right? Am I the first to be telling about this ridiculous thing you've done, getting married, 2 youngsters, and then going off to war? Yes, sir. You see, I've got to go at once. And like as not, her mother won't want it to get out about till she's a bit older. I thought I'd like to tell you, and in case they said it wasn't all straight and proper. Right? Obviously, the mother is sort of embarrassed. My daughter's too young, and now she got married, so she's going to basically keep her washing clothing in the house and keep this a secret. Nothing I say will alter the fact that you've falsified your ages. Jim grinned again. That's all right. I got it from a lawyer's clerk in my platoon. It's marriage all the same, right? Typical lawyerly loophole. Once you're married, even if you're married under false, facts and so on, you're married, right? And of course, it would come from it's actually the clerk to the lawyer, but that's where he learned it, right? Because, once remember seeing a bumper sticker on a car that said, "Don't hit me, my lawyer's in prison." Anyway, so he got this great piece of legal information from a lawyer's clerk, and they went ahead and got married anyway. Yes, I believe that's so. Well, sir, there she is till I come back. Suddenly his face changed. He looked for all the world as if he were going to cry. And they stood gazing at each other exactly as if they were alone. Of course he looks like he's going to cry. He's a kid. The lodger at the Carpenters, 3 doors down the street, was playing her usual afternoon solo on the piano. Connais-tu le pain? Do you know the country? From Mignon. And whenever I hear it now, seldom enough in days contemptuous of harmony, it brings Jim and Betty back through a broad sunbeam full of dancing motes of dust. It epitomizes for me all the drang, as the Germans would call it, of these horrible years, when marriage, birth, death, and every human activity was speeded up to their limit. And we did from year's end to year's end all that enlightened humanity should not be doing, and left undone most of what it should have done. All right, so what is he talking about? The Drang, there was a period in German literature known as Sturm und Drang, storm and stress. Interestingly, actually focused in many ways on the youth. The most famous novel was Goethe's Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, the sorrows of young Werther. But he's saying all the drang, all the suffering, all the stress of the period. Who knows? In the middle of a war, it doesn't seem to want to end. You speed things up. Am I going to wait to get married, or should I do it now because there might not be a later? So everything is speeded up, and that included getting married at a young and even unlawful age. What time is it, sir? Jim asked me suddenly. 5 o'clock. Lord, I must run for it. My kit's at the station. Could I leave her here, sir? I nodded and walked into the little room beyond. When I came back, she was sitting where she used to sit in school, bowed over her arms, spread out on the inky desk, right? Why does Goldsworthy create that image of Betty? Because it shows her to be the child she really is, right? A year or so before that, she was sitting in that seat at the desk. And now she's sitting there again, except that now she's married to a guy who's going off to war, but they're still kids. Jim had gone. Well, that was the normal state of Europe then. I went back into the little room to give her time, but when I returned once more, she had gone. The second winter passed, a year later. More muddy, more bloody even than the first, and less shot through with hopes of an ending, right? People were this isn't going to end. Showed me 3 or 4 of Jim's letters. Betty showed me 3 or 4 of Jim's letters. Simple screeds with a phrase here and there of awkward, half-smothered feeling, and signed always, your loving hubby, Jim. Her marriage was accepted in the village. Child marriage was quite common then. In April, it began to be obvious that their union was to be blessed, as they call it. What does that mean? She's pregnant. It's obvious because she's obviously showing signs of her stomach extending and so on. So in that period after the marriage and the short time they were together before he went off, she became impregnated. One day early in May, I was passing Mrs. Roof's, that's Betty's mother, when I saw the lady in her patch of garden and stopped to ask her after Betty. Near in her time, I've written to Jim Beckett happen he'll get leave. So she's written to her son-in-law, to Jim, over there, saying, Betty's about to give birth. They'll probably give you leave so you can be here when she has the baby. You're the father. I think that was a mistake, Mrs. Roof. I would have waited until it was over. Maybe you're right, sir, but Betty's that fidgety about him not knowing. She's dreadful young, to have a child. I didn't have my first till I was 21. Everything goes fast these days, Mrs. Roof. Not my washing. I can't get the help with Betty like this. It's a sad business, this about the baby coming. If he does get killed, I suppose she'll get a pension, sir. Great, typical mother-in-law, right? All right, if he gets killed, but she'll get money for, at least get a pension. Pension? Married in the wrong age, with the boy still under service age. If they came to look into it, I really didn't know. Oh, surely, Mrs. Roof, but we won't think about his being killed. Jim's a fine boy, as if being a fine boy prevents you from being killed. Mrs. Roof, worn face darkened. He was a fool to join up before his time. Plenty of chance after, seemingly. And then to marry my girl like this, well, young folk are fools. I was sitting over my pensions work one evening, a month later, for it had now fallen to me to keep things listed in the village, when someone knocked at my door, and who should be standing there but Jim Beckett? Why, Jim, got leave? I had to come and see her. I haven't been there yet. Didn't dare. How is she, sir? All right. Already sort of a hint of what's happened. When he said you have leave, he didn't really say, yes, I'm here on leave. He's just there. Pale and dusty, as if from a hard journey, his uniform all muddy and unbrushed, and his reddish hair standing up anyhow. He looked wretched. Poor boy. She's all right, Jim, but it must be very near from what her mother says. I haven't had any sleep for nights thinking of her. Such a kid she is. Does she know you're coming? No, I haven't said nothing. Better be careful. I wouldn't risk a shock. Have you anywhere to sleep? No, sir. Well, you can stay here if you like. They won't have room for you there. He seemed to back away from me. Thank you, sir. I wouldn't like to put you out. Not a bit, Jim. Delighted to have you and hear your adventures. He shook his head. I don't want to talk of them, he said darkly. Don't you think I could see you tonight, sir? I've come a long way for it. My God, I have. Right? Why doesn't he want to talk about his adventures? Because when he actually got there and was stuck in the trench and saw the death, the dying, the blood, the poison gas, the trench foot, the trench mouth, and people being blown up, you know what? War wasn't all that romantic anymore. Right? So they didn't want to talk about it. But he's really anxious to see Betty. Well, try, but see her mother first. Yes, sir. And he touched his forehead. His face, so young a face, already had that look in the eyes of men who stare death down. He went away, and I didn't see him again that night. They had managed apparently to screw him into their tiny cottage. He was only just in time, for 2 days later, Betty had a boy child. He came to me the same evening after dark, very excited. She's a wonder, he said. But if I'd known, I'd never have done it, sir. I never would. You can't tell what you're doing till it's too late, it seems. Strange saying from that young father, till afterwards it was made too clear. Betty recovered quickly and was out within 3 weeks. Jim seemed to have long leave. He was still about. But I had little talk with him, for though always friendly, he seemed shy of me, and as to talking of the war, not a word. One evening I passed from Betty leaning on a gate close to the river, a warm evening of early July, when the Somme battle was at its height. Out there hell incarnate, and here intense peace. The quietly flowing river, the willows, unstaring aspens, the lights slowly dying, and those two young things, with their arms around each other and their heads close together, her bobbed dark hair and Jim's reddish mop, getting quite long. I took good care not to disturb them. His last night, perhaps, before he went back into the furnace. Right. So again, it's very interesting. The parallel in the beginning, the schoolmaster contrasts the beauty of the summer night and the carnage going on the battlefield on the other side, on the continent. Now he sees these two youngsters again. Now they're husband and wife with a kid. And it's the same setting and the same concept. It's a beautiful night. beautiful, warm summer evening. But on the other side is the furnace, the death factory of the war. So the parallel, but it's a couple of other parallels. It was no business of mine to have my doubts, but I had been having them long before that dreadful night, when just as I was going to bed, something rattled at my window, and going down, I found Betty outside, distracted. "Oh, sir, come quick. They've arrested Jim." As he went over, she told me. So what do you think? Why did they arrest him? Anyone? You can unmute. Anyone? Why was he arrested? I mean, what did he do? He was AWOL. Away without leave. He was there. The schoolmaster, he's here for too long. Something's wrong. What was wrong? He realized Betty was going to give birth. He wanted to be there. After all, he's the father and the husband. So he left without leave and came back and stayed. You can't do that, especially in the middle of, as it says, the Battle of the Somme. You might remember, one of the big battles, right? Deadly battle. And the last thing they can give soldiers is leave to go home. Now give them paternity or maternity, whatever kind of leave they call it, in the middle of this deadly battle in France. So obviously he's done something wrong. He's committed a crime. And earlier on, remember when Goldsworthy wrote what a crime war is? So the question is, who's committed the crime? I mean, on the books, Jim just committed the crime. He left the scene of the battle without leave. But we're not finished yet. And the unanswered question, or maybe it is answered in a way, at the end of the story is who's committing the murder and who's committing the crime. So now he's been arrested. And for what? They've come and arrested him for deserting. What have I done? What have I done? Outside the Roos cottage, Jim was standing between a corporal's guard, and Betty flung herself into his arms. Inside, I could hear Mrs. Roof expostulating with the corporal and the baby crying. In the sleepy quiet of the village street, smelling of hay just harvested, it was atrocious, right? That harvested hay, back again. I spoke to Jim. He answered quietly in her arms. I asked for leave. They wouldn't give it. I had to come. I couldn't stick it, knowing how it was with her. Where was your regiment? In the line, right? It's the front lines, the battle. Good God. Just then the corporal came out. I took him apart. I was the schoolmaster corporal, I said. The poor chap joined up when he was just 16. He's still underage, you see, and now he's got this child wife and newborn baby. The corporal nodded. His face was twitching, a lined, decent face with a mustache. I know, sir, he muttered. I know. Cruel work, but I've got to take him. He'll have to go back to France. What does it mean? He lifted his arms from his sides and let them drop. And that gesture was somehow the most expressive and dreadful I ever saw. Deserting in the face of the enemy, he whispered hoarsely, bad business. Can you get that girl away, sir? But Jim himself undid the grip of her arms and held her from him. Bending, he kissed her hair and face, and then with a groan, he literally pushed her into my arms and marched straight off between the guard. And as I was left in the dark, sweet-scented street with a distracted child struggling in my grasp. Oh my God, over and over, and what could one say or do? All the rest of that night, after Mrs. Roof had got Betty back into the cottage, I set up writing in duplicate the facts about Jim Beckett. I sent one copy to his regimental headquarters, the other to the chaplain of his regiment in France. I sent fresh copies 2 days later with duplicates of his birth certificates to make sure. It was all I could do. And then came a fortnight of waiting, 2 weeks, for news. Betty was still distracted. The thought that through her anxiety, she herself had delivered him into the hands nearly sent her off her head. Probably her baby alone kept her from insanity or suicide. What is that? She probably made it known that Jim was there. If she hadn't, she's thinking this wouldn't have happened. They might not have noticed he was missing. Probably her baby alone kept her from insanity or suicide. And all that time, the battle of the Somme raged, and hundreds of thousands of women in England and France and Germany were in daily terror for their menfolk. Yet none, I think, could have had quite the feeling of that child. Her mother, poor woman, would come over to me at the schoolhouse and ask if I'd heard anything. Better, and what is she, he talks about, obviously, all of the women in all these countries that are at war, that clearly worried about the safety and the well-being of their sons and husbands and brothers or whatever. What is her worry? What is Betty's worry? It's not even that, he's back in the battlefield and, what could happen in the course of the battle. It's something else. But I had no news and could not get any at headquarters. The thing was being dealt with in France. Never was the scale and picture of the world's horrors more brought home to me. This deadly little tragedy was as nothing, just a fragment of straw whirling around in a terrible wind. And then one day I did get news, a letter from the chaplain, and seeing what it was, stuck it in my pocket and sneaked down to the river, literally afraid to open it till I was alone. Crouched up with my back to the haystack, I took it out with trembling fingers. Dear sir, the boy Jim Beckett was shot today at dawn. I'm distressed at having to tell you and the poor child, his wife, war is a cruel thing, indeed. I had known it. Poor Jim, poor Betty, poor Betty. William was shot at dawn. And we'll read the rest of the letter. He wasn't shot at dawn by the enemy. He was shot at dawn by his government because he committed an act of treason. Left the field of battle without permission. That's treason. And treason is punished by death. You get the death penalty. I did all I could. The facts you sent were put before the court martial and the point of his age considered, but all leave had been stopped. His request had been definitely refused. The regiment was actually in the line with fighting going on and the situation extremely critical at that sector. Private considerations count for nothing in such circumstances, the rule was adamant. Perhaps it has to be, I cannot say. But I've been greatly distressed by the whole thing, and the court itself was much moved. The poor boy seemed dazed. He wouldn't talk, didn't seem to take in anything. Indeed, they tell me that all he said after the verdict, certainly all I heard him say was, poor wife, over and over again. He stood up well at the end. He stood up well at the end. I can see him yet, poor impulsive Jim, desertion, but not cowardice, by the Lord. No one who looked into these straight blue eyes could believe that. But they bandaged them, I suppose. Well, a bullet in a billet, more or less. What was it in the wholesale slaughter? As a raindrop on a willow tree drips into the river and away to sea, so that boy, like a million others, dripped to dust. A little ironical, though, that his own side should shoot him, who went to fight for them 2 years before he need, to shoot him, who wouldn't be legal food for powder for another month. A little ironical, perhaps, that he had left his son, legacy to such an implacable world. There's no moral to a true tale like this, unless it be that the rhythm of life and death cares not a jot for any of us. Okay, so what's the point that Goldsworthy is making? First of all, the fortuitousness of death, especially in the case of war. We'll see this in some of the poems later on. You could be standing there, the bullet hits the guy right to your left, the guy to your right doesn't touch you, right? It's Wheel of Fortune. One guy's gone, the next guy isn't. And in general, life and death, you can't figure out why people are here in the morning and suddenly not there in the evening. But it's more than just the Wheel of Fortune or the impact of fate. What's happened here? I told you, he describes these guys going off to war with the word murder. He talks about crime. And what is Galsworthy suggesting? The soldiers don't commit murder. They kill because it's kill or be killed. Who commits the murder? The government that sends them off. The government turns a blind eye knowing the kid is underage, and then sends him anyway to fight in a brutal war that he's ill prepared for. That's murder. The crime isn't, I think what Goldsworthy is saying is the crime isn't desertion or treason. It's not. The real crime is the fact that this government that sent him off to fight, and he was willing to go, even at a young age, risk his life for an ideal that he probably had no clue about. Most of the soldiers had no idea what they were fighting for. But out of patriotism and a sense of obligation, he went, right? So is the crime the fact that he deserted, or is the real crime the fact that the government deserted him, first in sending him and then in killing him? So clearly, Goldsworthy's story is an attack on not just the concept of war, because he really wasn't against the British fighting Germany, but it's an attack on a government that sends off ill-prepared kids to fight this war and then mercilessly murders them when they suddenly take a leave and walk away from the fighting front. So it's clearly an anti-war sort of theme that emerges from the story. It's a really, really powerful story. One, because it reflects or mirrors, maybe it's fiction, it's historical fiction, but it reflects a fact. These things happened. These youngsters found their way onto the battlefield, even though they shouldn't have been there. Also, I think if you look deeper into it, the British in particular thought very little of their military leaders. The famous line, the soldiers were lions being led by donkeys, right? They were not only were the soldiers when they were young, ill-prepared, but the leadership was totally unprepared to fight this kind of a war, which is why it dragged out and why the death toll was so great. So it's an indictment, really an indictment of the government, the war in general, the way the war was conducted, and the lack of compassion really for these soldiers who became the victims of the decisions of their own country, of their own government. Very powerful piece of work. Just one last point. I don't have the syllabus in front of me. What's next? The Farewell to Arms, I believe. Anyone? Okay, well, I'll look at the syllabus. We're done now, and I'll send an announcement. I believe it's Ernest Hemingway. And Farewell of Arms is a great movie that goes along with it, and also a very poignant and moving message that goes along with the novel as well. So today's Tuesday. I'll send you an announcement, tell you how far to go in reading this novel for Thursday. Probably finish it next Tuesday and then see the movie version. Again, there are a number of movies I want you to see. I hope we have time, especially that German Weimar Republic movie M with Peter Lorre, famous actor, then came to America because of the Nazi regime and was in some of the greatest movies made in Hollywood. Maltese Falcon and others. He has a small part in Casablanca, which, if I haven't mentioned before, is the greatest movie of all time. So hopefully we'll have time to see that as well. Any questions about Goldsworthy or the story? Okay, so stay well and see you on Thursday. Please try and be on time, and see you then.
Have a good one, Professor.
Take care. Be safe.